Breaking, in a rare unanimous decision, the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled 9-0 in a case that bridges the Second and Fourth Amendments, and it's already being called one of the most significant rulings of the decade. The case, Barnes versus Felix, began as a dispute over police use of force and ended up reshaping how courts must analyze both gun rights and privacy rights. For gun owners, it creates a powerful new legal framework that protects the right to self-defense at the very moment of threat. And for every American, it redefines the rules for searches, seizures, and when force is justified. In this video, we'll walk through the story behind the case, the new moment of threat standard, the Supreme Court's rejection of narrow analysis, and the groundbreaking implications for both the Second and Fourth Amendments. We'll explain why this matters to gun owners, what it means for state and federal courts, and most importantly, what it means for your rights going forward. This is Firearms.Explained, and today, we're breaking down a 9-0 ruling that transforms the battlefield for freedom. Part 1. The story of Barnes versus Felix. The case of Barnes versus Felix started in a way that will sound familiar to many Americans. Mr. Barnes, a lawful gun owner, found himself in a confrontation with law enforcement officers who claimed he posed a threat. Barnes argued that he drew his firearm only to defend himself at the moment he reasonably believed he was in danger. The state, however, prosecuted him aggressively, arguing that because he had no right to resist what they called a lawful search, his act of self-defense was criminal. The lower courts sided with the state, applying a very narrow interpretation of both the Second and Fourth Amendments. Their reasoning was chilling. Because officers had technically initiated a lawful action, Barnes had no right to defend himself, even if the officers escalated into unlawful force. This interpretation created a dangerous precedent that a citizen's right to self-defense could vanish the moment the government declared its actions lawful. For gun owners, that meant the right to bear arms was effectively conditional, subject to being suspended by the very authorities the Second Amendment was meant to balance against. Barnes appealed, and after winding its way through multiple levels of litigation, the case landed in front of the Supreme Court. Few expected the court to go unanimous, but when the decision came down, the justices spoke with one voice. Part 2. The moment of threat standard. At the heart of the Supreme Court's decision was a new concept, the moment of threat standard. The justices ruled that the right to self-defense, including the right to keep and bear arms, cannot be analyzed by looking only at the beginning of a police encounter or government action. Instead, the focus must be on the exact moment when force is threatened or used. In Barnes's case, the court ruled that the critical question was not whether officers had a warrant or whether the initial stop was valid, but whether at the precise moment Barnes drew his firearm, he reasonably perceived a threat of unlawful force. This is monumental. Why? Because for years, lower courts have chipped away at the Second Amendment by zooming out, by looking at the overall legality of police actions or the government's broader interest in public safety. Under that approach, gun owners often lost. But under the moment of threat standard, the analysis becomes personal, immediate, and constitutional. Was the citizen, at that moment, facing a real or perceived threat? Did the law justify their defensive response? That is the lens the court says must now be applied. In simple terms, the government can't hide behind paperwork or broad claims of authority. When the moment of danger arrives, the citizen's right to defend themselves is alive and protected. Part 3. The Supreme Court's rejection of narrow analysis. One of the most striking parts of the court's opinion was its complete rejection of narrow, technical analysis. For years, many lower courts have applied what gun rights advocates call interest balancing. They would weigh the government's interest in safety against an individual's claim of self-defense, often ruling that the government's interests were more important. Similarly, in Fourth Amendment cases, courts often sided with law enforcement by narrowly defining what counted as reasonable. But in Barnes versus Felix, the justices unanimously rejected that approach. They declared that constitutional rights cannot be balanced away by policy preferences or bureaucratic convenience. The Second Amendment means what it says: the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The Fourth Amendment means what it says: citizens shall be secure against unreasonable searches and seizures. The court also sent a direct warning to lower courts. Stop rewriting rights to fit modern policy. The justices emphasize that both the Second and Fourth Amendments must be applied as written, informed by history and tradition, not by shifting political agendas. This rejection of narrow analysis marks a turning point. It means that in future cases, judges must look squarely at the rights themselves, not the excuses the government offers. For gun owners, that's a breath of fresh air, and for citizens concerned with privacy, it's a powerful new shield. Part 4. Why this matters to gun owners. For gun owners across the country, the court's ruling in Barnes versus Felix is more than a legal technicality. It's a real-world shield. Why? Because the old approach made your rights conditional. If the government said a search was valid or a stop was lawful, then your right to defend yourself practically vanished. You were expected to comply, even if force against you was excessive or unjust. The new ruling flips that script. Now, the law recognizes that your right to self-defense exists at the moment of danger. Whether it's a criminal attacker on the street or an escalation in a government encounter, your right doesn't disappear. This matters because self-defense isn't about paperwork or procedure. It's about survival. When the court unanimously ruled that Barnes's actions must be judged at the moment of threat, it recentered the law on the individual's natural right to defend life. For gun owners, this decision is a warning to prosecutors. They can no longer criminalize lawful defensive actions by waving around technicalities. It's also a signal to legislatures. Rationing or restricting defensive rights will face a far tougher road in the courts. Put simply, your right to keep and bear arms now has sharper teeth, and the courts are finally acknowledging it. Part 5. The Totality of Circumstances, a new legal framework. The court didn't stop at the moment of threat standard. It went further, introducing what it called the Totality of Circumstances analysis. Under this framework, judges must consider the full context of an encounter: the environment, the conduct of both parties, the immediacy of the danger, and the citizen's reasonable perception of threat. This is groundbreaking because it prevents the government from cherry-picking one small detail to justify stripping away rights. In the past, a court might say, well, the officer had a warrant, so everything that followed must be lawful. Under the new framework, that shortcut no longer works. Instead, courts must look at the whole picture. What really happened, moment by moment. For gun owners, this means that if you are ever forced to defend yourself, the law must take into account the actual reality you faced, not a sanitized government version of events. Think about how different that is. Instead of the state saying, you should have waited longer, or you should have trusted the officer, the question now becomes, what was the totality of the circumstances at the moment of the threat? That shift puts fairness back into the equation. It also aligns perfectly with the way the Second Amendment has always been understood, as a right rooted in real human experience, not abstract theory. Part 6. Repercussions for state and federal courts. The ripple effects of Barnes versus Felix will be felt in every courthouse across America. For state courts, especially in jurisdictions hostile to gun rights, the ruling is a game changer. Judges can no longer hide behind narrow, policy-driven interpretations. They must apply the moment of threat and totality of circumstances standards directly. That means state-level restrictions, prosecutions, and rulings that once seemed untouchable may now crumble under review. For federal courts, the ruling reinforces what the Supreme Court began in Bruin: a demand for fidelity to the Constitution. Lower federal judges who have resisted or watered down Second Amendment cases are now on notice. The unanimous nature of this ruling, 9-0, leaves no wiggle room. Even justices often divided by ideology agreed. The Second and Fourth Amendments must be honored fully. This decision also sets the stage for a flood of new cases. Expect challenges to laws that criminalize defensive actions, to policies that presume government authority outweighs personal liberty, and to rulings that minimize the role of citizen rights in encounters with law enforcement. In short, the courts must now treat your rights as real, immediate, and indivisible. That is the Supreme Court's message, and it's one that will reshape Second and Fourth Amendment litigation for decades to come. Part 7. The Gun Owner's Reality Check. Now, let's be clear. This ruling is a huge win for the Second Amendment, but it's also a reality check for every gun owner. The court affirmed that your right to defend yourself exists in the moment of threat. But that right is not a free pass. It comes with responsibility. Gun owners must understand that juries and judges will still examine their actions. They will ask, was the threat real? Was the response reasonable under the totality of circumstances? This means training matters more than ever. Situational awareness matters more than ever. Understanding the laws in your state matters more than ever. Because while the court strengthened your shield, it also clarified the rules of engagement. This is why knowledge is power. A firearm is only half of self-defense. The other half is knowing the law, understanding your rights, and exercising them with discipline. The Supreme Court gave us a victory, but it's up to us to use it wisely. Part 8. The role of the Second and Fourth Amendment together. What makes Barnes versus Felix so groundbreaking is not just its impact on the Second Amendment, but the way it ties that right directly to the Fourth Amendment. The Second Amendment protects your right to keep and bear arms. The Fourth Amendment protects your right to be secure against unreasonable searches and seizures. For the first time in modern history, the Supreme Court has woven these two protections together into a single fabric of liberty. The court made clear that self-defense cannot be divorced from the broader right to privacy and security. When the government oversteps, whether through excessive force or unreasonable intrusion, your right to defend yourself is not erased, it is reinforced. This creates a powerful new doctrine, the idea that your right to bear arms and your right to be free from unreasonable seizures work together. They are not separate silos. They are part of the same constitutional shield, protecting citizens from abuse of power. This is why gun rights and privacy rights rise or fall together. If one is weakened, the other suffers. And if both are defended, liberty grows stronger for everyone. Part 9. What this means going forward. So where do we go from here? The Supreme Court's 9-0 ruling in Barnes versus Felix sets a precedent that will echo for decades. For gun owners, it means your right to self-defense is more secure than it has been in years. For every American, it means the courts must respect not just government authority, but individual liberty at the moment it matters most. In the months ahead, expect to see lower courts adjusting to this new framework. Expect to see prosecutors reconsider how they bring charges in defensive gun cases. Expect to see states scrambling to rewrite laws that no longer pass constitutional muster. But also expect resistance. Some states will test the boundaries, passing new restrictions or pushing back against the court's clarity. That's why staying informed and engaged is critical, because every right not understood is a right at risk. The Supreme Court has spoken unanimously. The Second and Fourth Amendments stand together, strong and immediate. But the defense of those rights doesn't end in Washington, D.C. It continues in every state, every courtroom, and every home where freedom is valued. This is Firearms.Explained, and this has been the breakdown of a landmark decision. Subscribe, stay informed, and stay ready. Because the law is only power when you understand it. And today, that power belongs to you.